Thank you very much. It's great to be here in Winnipeg. I'm Richard Gage. I've been a practicing architect for 20 years. I became interested in these collapses after hearing the startling conclusions of a reluctant 9/11 researcher, Davida Ray Griffina, on the radio in March of 2006. This has changed my life radically and launched my personal and professional quest for 9/11 truth, inspiring me to found the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. I want to thank you guys for being willing to take on the difficult subject of the destruction of the World Trade Center and the staggering loss of life on 9/11. It's extremely important that we know the truth about this event because it served as the pretext for two wars, the invasion of two countries, in which almost 1 million people have already perished. It could happen again if we don't dedicate ourselves to finding out exactly what happened and why. These are the reasons we must peer into this painful part of our recent history. And to find out why, for instance, a 2006 poll by the New York Times CBS News revealed that 28% of Americans believe the Bush administration is lying not just about Iraq, but about the events of 9/11. Of even greater concern, another poll by Scripps Howard Ohio University, which found that a shocking 16% believe that the World Trade Center towers were brought down by controlled demolition with explosives. Unfortunately, my research of the last 12 months has confirmed that this is true. This is why we now have the Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, and why the 9/11 Truth movement itself is growing by millions every year. This afternoon, I'll present to you the very clear evidence that all three World Trade Center buildings, the high-rises, the iconic Twin Towers, and Building 7, were destroyed not by fire, as our government has told us, but by controlled demolition with explosives. I'm employed with a San Francisco Bay Area architecture firm, and like many other architects, I've designed numerous fireproofed steel frame buildings in my career. Most recently, these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums. And I've also been responsible for the day-to-day construction administration services for this $120 million new high school in San Ramon, California. I'm now working on quite a large project in Nevada with almost 2 million square feet of retail, parking structure, and steel-framed high-rise office space with over 10,000 tons of steel framing. But why have most of the architects that I have so far shown this presentation to joined AE911truth.org in calling for a new independent investigation into these collapses on 9/11? And these engineers, you'll find all of them listed on our website, AE911truth.org. Why is Time magazine posting the story that 36% of Americans, and according to this other poll, believe that the administration is somehow complicit in the events of 9/11? The Washington Post, citing the 16% figure of Americans believing the Twin Towers were brought down by explosives. Why have 100 well-known prominent Americans called for an independent probe into 9/11? 110 9/11 survivor and family members, 120 distinguished professors, all independently calling for a new investigation. Well, on 9/11, the American people were subjected to repeated shocking attacks, killing thousands of Americans. This has not happened since Pearl Harbor. The 5 years since 2001 has given us enough time to actually become objective. We have to step out from underneath the hypnotic trance that we were put in and gather the evidence that exposes the need to reevaluate these three World Trade Center high-rise collapses more objectively. Let's begin with an overview of the events of that morning so we can all get on the same page and take a look at the myth that developed.
September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth: the impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire, that caused collapse.
Buildings are destroyed by a number of different forces, each having very different identifiable characteristics. For instance, fires affect building differently than controlled demolition and explosions. Fires, by their nature, tend to creep from place to place as they run out of fuel and find fresh fuel sources, leaving behind the burned out area to cool. Now, when collapses do occur, and they have never in a high-rise office building, but for instance in wood buildings, they begin gradually and asymmetrically with large, visible, slow deformations. So remember this. Controlled demolition we'll be taking a very close look at. When buildings topple, as in earthquakes like this, their mass tends to hold together. They don't pulverize to concrete. When buildings pancake, like this concrete building in an earthquake in Mexico, you tend to see a whole lot of pancakes on the bottom. We'll be looking for those pancakes when we get to the World Trade Center. And when buildings explode, we see flashes of light, visible streamers, lots and lots of explosive smoke and dust from pulverized concrete. These buildings fell over or collapsed. They tend to hang together. They don't pulverize to dust. They follow the path of least resistance. They don't fall straight down through themselves and turn to dust. Note the thick, dense billowing and enormous clouds with explosions. The shooting streamers, flashes of light. We'll be looking for these elements in all 3 World Trade Center high-rise collapses. This one on the lower right looks just like the Twin Towers, but it is not. It is an acknowledged explosion. We'll be comparing it to the Twin Towers. Let's focus on controlled demolition first. We have hundreds of examples of controlled demolition from all across the country from which to make our comparison to Building 7. Because it's the most commonly used method to bring high-rise buildings down or demolish them. This is what a high-rise looks like when it's being demolished. Controlled demolitions can be engineered in many different ways. Normally, the purpose of a controlled demolition is to remove a structure while avoiding damage to adjacent structures and to do so economically. Typically, a tall building is demolished by placing thousands of cutter charges adjacent to columns and beams throughout the building, and then detonating them in precise order, starting with the interior structure and then progressing outward and upward, synchronistically timed floor by floor. Destroying the interior columns allows the unsupported weight to pull the exterior inward, and destroying the building from the ground up allows the weight of the building to be harnessed to do much of the destruction. The result is an implosion, producing a vertical collapse at free fall speed into a consolidated rubble pile, which is broken up and ready for loading and shipment. This is what we see in all three of the World Trade Center high-rise buildings, and we'll take a close look. Now, this is a feat that only a handful of companies in the world can accomplish. And we're told that fire accomplished exactly this for the first time ever on 9/11. So what are the typical features of these of controlled demolitions? Well, we have direct evidence of explosives, starting with sounds produced by explosions, rapid onset of destruction at the base, dust clouds, thick, billowing, and enormous, pulverized concrete. We have evidence of cutter charges. We have squibs, or explosive cutter charges, visible at the upper floors, demolition waves which remove column support, and a total collapse of the steel skeleton, broken up and ready for shipment. In addition to this direct evidence, well, the result of all of this is a straight-down, symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint, because all columns are cut on a floor at once, synchronistically timed, resulting in a free fall speed of collapse. So we'll be comparing these features to Building 7 right away here, one by one. In addition, we have no typical characteristics of destruction by fire: the large, slow deformations, the creeping from place to place, the asymmetrical collapse of any structure that is destroyed by fire. But also, we have government documentation, which we'll be looking at in the case of Building 7, expert corroboration. Do controlled demolition experts say that this was a controlled demolition in the case of Building 7? Do we have foreknowledge of the collapse? Well, we always know when controlled demolitions, they're planned months in advance. Turns out in Building 7, we'll be finding foreknowledge. We have plenty of video documentation, all of which goes to support the hypothesis of controlled demolition, which turns out to be quite easy. So let's see if Building 7 has any of these features. Well, Building 7 is this tall, 47-story skyscraper. How many of you have never heard of Building 7? Usually there's a whole bunch of people. Most of Americans have not. It's 47 stories. It was never hit by an airplane. It suffered some damage by the North Tower when it came down. And we'll see what happened to it. It's about a football field length away from the North Tower on the other side of Building 6. You can see Building 7 here in the aftermath after the Twin Tower, North Tower came down. So here's the building in its pristine condition and then being pelted during the collapse of the North Tower. We'll be taking a look at all of this dust coming up in a moment. Now here we have a shadow of this building on Building 7. Remember, 47 stories, so don't get confused by the shadow line above the fires. There are 2 or 3 fairly small fires, which is the only graphic evidence we have of fires in this building. There's smoke on the other side, and there's some dispute whether that was part of the Building 7 on fire or another building behind it. So we have 2 small fires, never hit by a plane, random damage from the Twin Towers. So let's march our way through the evidence here, and you can follow along in your handout to see where we are and how we're doing. Let's take a look at CBS video and listen to Dan Rather.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
I want to show you this again because I want to refer your attention to the penthouse, which falls first, indicating core column
damage. What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself.
Describe that.
Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Even Dan can pick up the obvious comparison to controlled demolition. Let's take a look at the NB's, and he never repeated that statement again, by the way. How does this happen? We have 24 core and 57 perimeter columns around this building. What could make all 81 of these columns fail simultaneously so that the building would collapse straight down, rapidly, symmetrically, in 6.5 seconds? How is that possible? Since the small fires and the damaged columns were only on one side, we're told by NIST and FEMA that the columns were damaged on this side, we're looking at the other side. Wouldn't we expect, for instance, if I broke my leg and I was going to fall toward the injury, that the building would do the same? No. The only way to do this is to take out all the columns at once. Now, this is an unusual building. It was built over a Con Edison substation, so there were some large spans spanning across the Con Edison, some trusses, cantilevered beams, and so forth, which would make it even more vulnerable if one of those supporting elements, the column or a truss, were to go down in a fire, which, remember, is not all the way around the building uniformly, heating all those columns up at once. No. The building would fall over, favor one side. Let's take a look, finally, at the north side on West Street. Okay, now, watch this. What do you see in the upper right corner? Anybody? You see 4 explosions. We're going to be taking a close look at those. There's no fire engulfing this building. There is no fire alleged to have been on those upper floors either. Watch them. Okay, we'll take a closer. Coming right up. Do we have sounds and sights of explosions in Building 7? Let's listen to an interview with this emergency worker.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. Then, about a second later, the bottom floor caves out. And the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. We were in shock, and then the worst part about it, we saw the smoke and the plumes of smoke coming out.
A shock wave ripping through the building, windows busting out, and then the building coming down.
We were watching.
Craig Bartner of the New York Fire Department.
And the whole time you're hearing boom, 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 boom. So I think I know an explosion when I hear it, I was real close to Building 7 when it fell down. And running away from that, sucked.
This incredible dust flow you're seeing right now, I want you to watch that very carefully. It's the only evidence we have of this massive pyroclastic, pulverized concrete and pyroclastic flow or heat-induced cauliflower-like expansion of the dust that we can see in Building 7, which is direct evidence of explosives.
That's one of the things that I live with all the time, and I don't know, but that didn't sound like just a building falling down to me while I was running away from it. There's a lot of eyewitness testimony down there hearing explosions. I didn't see any reason for that building to fall down the way it did, and a lot of guys should be saying the same thing.
This is why I do not argue with structural engineers about fires and what they can and can't do to steel. 90% of our evidence is not attacking the NIST report or the FEMA report, but showing the evidence of demolition, which is undeniable. Let's look at what fire does, though, to the building. Because the New York Times cited that experts said no building like it, a modern steel-framed high-rise, had ever collapsed due to fire. And fireproofing is intended to protect a building for 2 or 3 hours at the most. And even then, buildings have never collapsed in a fire of any duration that is high-rise steel-frame buildings. Even though, for instance, in these fires, numerous examples of which they burned for well over 3 hours. In this case, Caracas, 17 hours over 26 floors. Did the building collapse? No. Los Angeles, 3.5 hours over 5 floors. Did the building collapse? No. Philadelphia, Meridian Plaza, 18 hours over 8 floors. Did it collapse? No. New York, 50 stories high. It burned for 6 hours. None of these have collapsed. They're all in use today, having been refurbished. And yet, on 9/11, these 2 small fires on one side of Building 7 are responsible for bringing this building down in 6.5 seconds. After burning all afternoon, it came down at 5 in the afternoon. If there again were fires on the other side, we'd expect the building to fall away from us and favor its injury, not come straight down. Again, buildings that collapse follow the path of least resistance, not straight down through themselves. It's completely diametrically opposed to every principle of structural engineering, which is designed to resist the forces of gravity. That structural engineers can identify with. Am I right? Where's my structural engineer? Government documentation. Well, we had 4 reports. American Society of Civil Engineers, FEMA, Silverstein, Weidlinger, and NIST. Throughout each one of these reports, we have the same cast of characters coming and going through them. We're told that they were volunteers, but these volunteers were not volunteers like you go down to the PTA and say, I'll help out. These were highly paid defense contractors who had ongoing contracts with the federal government at $10 million annually. So they had a huge stake in producing a report that favored their client. This is not unbiased. We have the FEMA report with only $600,000 of funding. Up until 2004 or 5, that was the only report we had from the government, and compare that funding to $40 million for the Bill Clinton affair with Monica. So we're not looking at a serious effort to get at the truth here. NIST finally got a 3-year, $20 million project, which we're going to be taking a quick look at, which is an incredibly highly polished effort at concealing the truth. FEMA suggests, however, thank you very much, that the collapse of World Trade Center 7 had a small debris field as the facade was pulled downward, suggesting internal failure and implosion. Demolishing the building so that it collapses straight down into its own footprint requires such skill that only a handful of demolition companies in the world will attempt it. But thank God, fire did it on 9/11 without having to pay the demolition contractors. The specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown. This is after 3 years of study. We don't know what happened. Our best hypothesis, fire, then complete collapse, has only a low probability of occurrence. Further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. Unfortunately, though, for investigators hoping to resolve the issue, the evidence had been completely destroyed by FEMA before it could be resolved. NIST had no steel from World Trade Center 7 to analyze. The 9/11 Commission, who was sworn to give us the complete, fullest possible account of the events surrounding 9/11, did not even mention the building in one page or one sentence of their 571-page report. Max Cleland, for this and other reasons, resigned from the commission, stating this is a national scandal. This investigation is compromised. Do we have a free fall speed of collapse? Well, here's a second-by-second drop of the building. With each passing second, the building drops faster. This indicates acceleration, which is due to gravity, and no resistance to that acceleration in the columns. You can plot the data on a graph of time over distance drop, and then you can lay a theoretical curve of free fall right over it, and it fits perfectly, indicating the columns were removed, which could only be done by explosives. Do we have expert corroboration? Well, here's the top European controlled demolition expert, Danny Jawenko. It starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. This is a controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. This is professional work without a doubt. Okay? We have to deal with this. We can't go home and say, well, I'm not an expert in controlled demolition, so I don't really know what happened. This is why we have experts telling us what really happened. And indeed, just like in a court case, you'll have experts on every side of every issue. And you are the jury. You have to decide who's telling the truth and who's lying through their teeth. This is a responsibility of every one of us as citizens. In my opinion, the building World Trade Center 7 was with great probability professionally demolished, says Hugo Bachmann, Professor Emeritus and former chairman of the Department of Structural Dynamics and Earthquake Engineering. Is there evidence of squibs in World Trade Center 7? Let's take a closer look in this side-by-side comparison of Building 7 to a known demolition. So we have Building 7 on the left and this known demolition on the right.
Edifici ad anni da impatto. In ogni caso non vi sono prove di demolizione controllata. I filmati portati a sostegno di questa tesi sono ingannevoli perché mostrano.
Looks like they both come down in about 6 seconds. Building, look on the left, upper right corner, focusing in on those squibs. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are explosions. You have to deal with those explosions. This video is not fixed. Let's watch it again.
In ogni caso non vi sono prove di demolizione controllata.
Before someone argues with you about what fire can or can't do to a building, you tell them, you watch this video, and you tell me what those puffs of smoke are. There's no fire up in that corner. The video is not touched up. This is evidence suitable for a court of law, right from network television. Okay? Did I make my point? Is there molten metal, and why, found at the bottom of the World Trade Center? Let's listen to Mark Loiseau.
Mark Loiseau, the president of Controlled Demolition Incorporated, told the American Free Press that in the basements of the World Trade Center, where 47 central support columns connected to the bedrock, hot spots of literally molten steel were discovered more than a month after September 11th. These incredibly hot areas were found at the bottoms of the elevator shafts, down 7 basement levels. The molten steel was found 3, 4, and 5 weeks later when the rubble was being removed. He said that molten steel was also found at World Trade Center 7. The highest temperature was in the east corner of the South Tower, where a temperature of 1,377 degrees Fahrenheit was recorded. The molten steel in the basement was more than double that temperature.
And the reason is because the molten steel is down in the basement. Those were surface temperatures that NASA was reading. Now, up here, B and A, that's building 7. Those temperatures are 1,340 degrees on the surface. Any fire is probably at most about 1,300 to 1,400 degrees in the building. These are surface temperatures. Remember, that pile of building was about 7 or 8 stories tall. The surface temperature is coming through the pile 1,300 degrees. That's why below the temperature must have been even much greater. There's plenty of evidence for molten metal. In fact, the fires get to be 1,200, 1,400, sometimes 1,800 degrees hydrocarbon fires. And by the way, that includes jet fuel fires. But molten metal, well, the salmon you see in this color is 1,500 degrees. The lemon color is 1,800 degrees, much hotter than a hydrocarbon fire can burn. Structural steel doesn't even begin to melt until 2,700 degrees. What produced this molten metal? NIST denies molten metal. FEMA denies that there's any molten metal. You're going to see more evidence of molten metal. Thermite produces molten metal at 4,500 degrees. What is thermite? We're going to find out. It's an incendiary cutting charge, which we've found evidence at all 3 buildings we'll be seeing. This is previous molten metal which is solidified. It's rust. It's not aluminum from any airplane. And aluminum doesn't rust. They call these meteorites. They found them all over the place. Tons of this previously solidified.
Unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
This fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat into one single element.
Do we have foreknowledge of the collapse in Building 7? Well, what does Chief Nick Visconti say of the New York Fire Department? We're moving the command post over this way. That building's coming down. They knew it was coming down. Now, never before in history has a steel frame high-rise building come down due to fire. Firemen don't shriek from their responsibility to go into a high-rise and put it out. Our codes protect buildings quite well, and they've never come down before. But all of a sudden, on this day, they're saying the building's going to collapse. Indira Singh, EMT, by noon, 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from that triage site up to Pace University a little farther away because Building 7 was going to come down or being brought down. Is that what they said? Yeah. They said we're going to have to bring it down. Let's see what these police and these unusual workers have to say caught on this CNN tape.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up. Move it back. All right, guys. We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
Now we're told that the building's going to blow up. It's not just coming down. So we're getting a little closer toward the truth. These policemen were obviously told. Not only that, BBC announces the collapse of Building 7 20 minutes before it happened. Here is Jane Stanley announcing. It says, the 47-story Solomon Brothers building close to the World Trade Center has also collapsed. Well, there's the building right behind her. It has not collapsed. Do these people go by a script, or are they doing real-time reporting? What is the issue here? Well, they're being fed information, and I'm going to encourage you to ask Barry Zwicker a lot of questions about this. Who was in the building? Well, we have the CIA, the IRS, the Department of Defense, Securities and Exchange Commission, which, by the way, lost thousands of files related to hundreds of active cases against Wall Street companies such as Enron and WorldCom. Could Al-Qaeda have gotten into this building to plant the explosives? It's a simple question. It deserves a thoughtful answer. So, what have we shown in Building 7? Well, we've shown direct evidence of explosives because we have sights and sound produced by explosions with the eyewitnesses you've seen, a rapid onset of the destruction at the base, the clap of thunder, and the building coming down, those huge dust clouds billowing, enormous, from the pulverized concrete, the cutter charges or pools of molten iron from thermite, and we're going to be proving later that this is from thermite. Squibs, or explosive charges, visible at the upper 7 stories on the right side of Building 7. Deal with it. Demolition waves, removing the column support simultaneously all around the building, floor by floor, synchronistically timed. And a total collapse of the steel skeleton broken up and ready for shipment. All of that producing a straight-down symmetrical collapse into its own footprint, free fall speed, virtually. No resistance from the columns. We have no typical characteristics of fire with large deformations creeping from place to place and slow deformations or asymmetrical collapse, as we see in fires. We have government documentation which shows that they have no hypothesis that they value themselves, FEMA. We have expert corroboration from one controlled demolition expert, the top in Europe. We have foreknowledge of the collapse, that it's going to blow up, that they're moving the command center away, they're moving people back like 7 blocks. And of course, we have plenty of video documentation which you've seen, all of which goes to support the hypothesis of controlled demolition. Now, no building exhibiting all the characteristics of controlled demolition has never not been a controlled demolition. Let's take a look at the Twin Towers. Because the evidence, as great as it was for Building 7, is far greater for the Twin Towers. This was the crowning achievement of the international style, according to some. Moronic gigantism, according to others. And heartless modernism. However you feel about the buildings, let's take a close look at how they were destroyed. These buildings surpassed the tallest building in the world at the time, becoming 1,368 feet high with a 12.5-foot floor-to-floor height. There were structural innovations which I'll show you in this unique building, 208 feet square, which allowed a complete open plan. 60 feet span in this direction and 35-foot span in this direction. All high-rises after this time followed this innovation. It was actually quite incredible, and it worked quite well. We'll take a close look at this structure. 11 million square feet. But almost immediately we have difficulty renting the space. It took years to approach full occupancy with undesirable office space, gun-slit windows, low ceilings. It was subsidized financially, finally, by the tenancy of Governor Rockefeller, who put his entire state offices in there of 20,000 employees. The building was a disaster financially in the first decade. They had difficulties renting it, and it required numerous renovations in the first decade as well. $200 million for asbestos removal, which became a hot issue almost immediately upon its construction. $800 million for rebuilding electrical communications and cooling systems. And galvanic corrosion was endemic, eating away at the connection between the structural steel and the aluminum cladding around the outside. The Port Authority denied permits for controlled demolition on several occasions. due to the asbestos content which would have been released into the atmosphere. Were they going to tear it down and rebuild it? It would have cost $5.6 billion to take it down to its structure with the scaffolding, somewhere up to $15 billion, some say. They were basically condemned structures. Nevertheless, 3 months prior to 9/11, we have a transfer of ownership with a 99-year lease to Larry Silverstein, transferring all of this real estate to him and his partners for $3.2 billion. Larry, I believe it's now $125 million of his own money he invested. And why would he do this if it was going to take $5.6 billion to $15 billion to repair it? Did he have some knowledge that he was going to be assisted in his demolition effort? The lease he signed had an all-important escape clause. If the buildings are struck by an act of terrorism, the new owner's obligations under the lease are void. This is extremely unusual, I am told. I'm not an expert in leases. Maybe some of you are. As a result, the owners are not required to make any payments under their lease. We'll be able to collect the insurance, and indeed Silverstein is on his way to collecting $7 billion. He's got $4.6 already. The insurance companies made out as well. You might feel sorry for them under the circumstances. They raised their premiums over 2,000%. They came out smelling like a rose. In its place, the Freedom Tower is scheduled to rise to 1,776 square feet and will be a major profit center for Larry and the Port Authority as well. The Twin Towers were very unique at the time with a dense grid of up to this time, these buildings had a dense grid of steel, as you can see, and or concrete frames all the way through the building, every 30 feet or so. The Twin Towers were built as a tube structure with this very strong, dense mesh of steel surrounding the exterior, acting as a bearing wall and to resist all the lateral forces. Inside was the core, a dense grid of 47 immense steel box columns, 4-inch thick at the base and 2-inch thick at mid-height, narrowing to a 1/4-inch thick at the height at the top. Prefabricated floor assemblies with 20-gauge steel deck over 29-inch deep steel web joists were topped with 4 inches of reinforced concrete, all of which was completely pulverized on 9/11. We'll be looking for evidence of these 110 pancakes at the bottom of the Twin Towers. The trusses were welded and bolted to the beams at the core and also at the spandrel panels at the perimeter bearing wall. So these were solidly constructed buildings. They were not designed to pancake, as you may have heard ludicrously mentioned by some, with 47 steel core columns and 240 perimeter columns. The perimeter structure was over-designed with a ratio of 20-1 because this was a new structure and they weren't taking any chances. The steel frame is a 100,000-ton heat sink. Any 1,400-degree fire, as was alleged, or 1,800-degree in some cases, alleged to have occurred near the core columns, would have been absorbed and dissipated through this incredible heat sink. But as we'll see, temperatures of such, there's no evidence for these temperatures whatsoever, even so. So you can see at the base, this incredible core column is almost solid steel. And they're rising up, 47 of them here. And these are the metal decks and the perimeter columns with the spandrel panels. All capped by a hat truss, which serves to tie the perimeter and the core columns together as well as support the massive concrete antenna, which was 300 feet high. Let's take a look and see what the imperative was for jetliner proofing the building.
John Skilling and Les Robertson were the structural engineers who designed the streamlined steel frames of the Twin Towers in the 1960s. Because a wayward Army bomber flew into the Empire State Building in 1945, The towers were built with skyscraper crashes in mind.
The airplane we were envisioning was the largest airplane of its time, flying slowly and low, lost in the fog. We designed the buildings to take the impact of the Boeing 707 hitting the building at any location.
The Boeing 707, by the way, has a kinetic energy equal to that of the 767, which hit the Twin Towers on 9/11, because the 707 flies much faster, 500 miles per hour versus 400 for the 767. I believe those figures are correct. So you can look at that calculation on Jim Hoffman's site, 911research.com. So what does John Skilling say? The World Trade Center structural engineer over Leslie Robertson. The biggest problem would be the fact that all the fuel would dump into the building. And if that happened, there'd be a fire. So this was taken into account by the words from John Skilling's mouth himself. Now, both FEMA and NIST acknowledged that the impacts virtually did nothing to the structural integrity of the building. They stood for 56 minutes and 102 minutes, respectively, after their initial impacts. And the building swayed. They came to a stop. The forces were routed around the impact. And FEMA, of course, says, well, what happened was the fireproofing was knocked off. That made the steel vulnerable to the intense fires. We'll be taking a look at that allegation. Let's look at the drawings that we get from PBS NOVA and FEMA. Quite deceptive illustrations. In this case, we see a bunch of pancakes stacked up, ready to fall down with no core columns. There's this effort to deny that there was a core in these buildings by the 9/11 Commission itself, which said the core was a hollow steel shaft, by these, which really trying to sell something to the American people. Reminds me of some of the mortgage advertisements I get in my mail with these low interest rates and low payments. It's a total deception. In the case of the trusses, they're not shown with their cross bridging. They're not shown with the steel decking, which is topped with 4 inches of concrete, all of which goes to support it. We don't see a core in the case of this drawing until you read the fine print and realize that, oh yeah, one's a core column and one's a perimeter column, and we're talking about the span between them. And in this drawing on the upper left here, you see a fairly representative example of how the columns in the core align fairly orthogonally, in line, and are represented according to their scale. But in the FEMA and NIST drawings, you see them almost the scale of toothpicks, or about the same size as the perimeter columns, which are 14-inch by 14-inch square. Remember, these corner columns are 52 inches by 22 inches. And the other ones, not in a corner, are 30 inches by 16 inches, completely shown out of scale here and randomly placed instead of orthogonal. So there's a whole distortion effort. The drawings for the World Trade Center were recently leaked from somebody in a Silverstein-Weidlinger report. We have them now on our site, ae911truth.org. You can download them. You can look at all the floors. And here's an example of the 66th floor, which shows the correct columns here. This is the core that I've zoomed in on now. Core columns are very large and orthogonally arranged, just like that diagram you saw earlier. So what the theory is that the first theory is the pancaking theory, where the truss became disconnected from the exterior columns one by one and zippered all the way around the building, causing this pancake collapse. The next theory that NIST came up with after they threw that one out is that no, they blame the persistence of these connections between the truss and the exterior columns, because as the truss heated up from the fire, it sagged up to 42 inches, we're told, which turns out to be a crock, and pulled in the perimeter columns, causing them to buckle and fail. Either way, it doesn't add up at all, and it ignores all of the demolition evidence that you're about to see. Now, when we go to show the demolition for the Twin Towers, it's out of the range of our experience because controlled demolitions typically have not been from the top down, so we don't have a frame of reference from which to view this. So what if somebody was going to blow up the World Trade Center and blame it on jet plane impacts, you'd start at the location of the jet impact and work your way downward. And indeed, that's what we see. Let's take a look and compare this to a typical controlled demolition because there are some key differences. We have a rapid onset of destruction, but not at the base, up at the location of the jet impacts. We have a straight-down symmetrical collapse, not into its own footprint, but blown outside its own footprint. We'll take a close look. And all the columns are cut on a floor at once. They're not so much cut as cut and then blown laterally. We're going to take a close look at what that means. Otherwise, there are very similar features. Let's start with the sights and sounds produced by explosions. This is Jim Hoffman.
The way I describe what happened to the towers is that they were, I don't think you can get around calling these explosions. They exploded into these clouds of dust with steel hurling in all directions. And these explosions became over 500 feet in diameter by the time they reached the ground. Actually, more like 800 feet in diameter. And, but the reason I think people don't think of them as explosions is because they occurred over a period of 15 seconds in either case. So there wasn't a particularly, like, normally people think of an explosion as you hear a loud crack, a bang, and then it's just that one event. But if you have, in the case of a demolition where you might have thousands of explosions that are all blending in, then you get one huge explosive event, but you don't hear any distinct explosions that's so much above the roar of it. The thing sounded like, sort of like an ocean wave, just this incredibly loud roar. But incredibly explosive. The tops, I described them as mushrooming because they blew out so far.
Well, we have lots of witnesses because the New York Times sued the city of New York and gained access by a state court of appeals to the oral histories, which the city of New York was denying any access to, and you'll see why. There's over 118 quotes. I won't read them all to you. We felt the ground shake. You could see the towers sway, and then it just came down. The ground shook, then it came down. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. I thought I heard an explosion. It actually shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. I heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. Heard the noise, and then debris started flying everywhere. Let's take a look and listen to what the news reporters say initially, and then you never hear again after the first day.
And then the subsequent collapse. We've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted.
The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself.
Anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
Like, it sounded like gunfire, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
At 10:30, I tried to leave the building, but as soon as I got outside, I heard a second explosion, and another rumble, and more smoke, and more dust. I ran inside the buildings, the chandelier shook, and again, black smoke filled the air. Within another 5 minutes, we were covered again with more silt and more dust. And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
There was a heavy-duty explosion. Some of the secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
The full impact was seen in the moment in time. My colleague Stephen Evans, who was in the Trade Center and was interviewed just after the first explosion.
There was another big explosion in the other tower. Flames coming out in this billowing grey smoke.
How many of you heard about explosions in the World Trade Center before you became aware of these recently from 9/11 Truth Movement? 1, 2, 3, 4. So there were some reports that got out. What did the New York Fire Department guys say?
Yeah, where the fuck? What did we do? We made it outside. We made it about a block.
We made it at least two blocks, and we started running. Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
if
detonated.
they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down. I was watching it and running.
Just ran up West
And then you just sort of this cloud of shit chasing you down.
Couldn't outrun it.
West Street. I couldn't outrun it.
So what'd you do?
I jumped behind a battalion car, I hit under the car, I was just waiting to die.
He saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. It seemed like on television when they blow up these buildings, it seemed like it was going all the way around like a belt, all these explosions. I saw low-level flashes. Somewhere around the middle of the World Trade Center there was this orange and red flash coming out. I thought the terrorists planted explosives somewhere in the building. That's how loud it was. Crackling, explosive, a wall. With each popping sound, it was initially an orange and then a red flash coming out of the building. Pop, pop, pop. That's exactly what, because I thought that's what it was, an explosion. Suddenly there was another loud boom at the upper floors, and then there was a series of smaller explosions which appeared to go completely around the building at the upper floors, and another loud earth-shattering blast with a large fireball which blew out more debris. Flash, flash, flash. Then it looked like the building came down. Let's see what all these flashes and these sounds of explosions are from.
Buildings as they fall into their footprint. The tremendous, billowing clouds of dust. Now let's look at the collapse of the Twin Towers. We are seeing explosions rather than implosions, a first in demolition history. A sequenced rumble becomes a roar as debris is thrown outward. The damage is not contained. Even the windows are blown from neighborhood buildings. What kind of energy enabled this? Would fire hurl metal and concrete sideways into the air? Here, a 600,000-pound chunk of steel, twice the weight of a Boeing airliner, was flung 400 feet, wedging itself deep into 3 World Financial Center on Vesey Street. A FEMA photographer taking pictures of Ground Zero wondered why so many steel beams were jutting from neighborhood buildings. Watt shot pieces of the towers all the way across the street. In April 2006, New Yorkers were distressed to learn that bone fragments, human remains from 9/11, had been found on the roof of the nearby Deutsche Bank building.
And how, in God's name, did those fragments get there?
It surprised me that there was still bone fragments or human remains that had not been discovered.
How is it possible that after 5 years they're finally looking on the rooftops of the Deutsche building? I mean, that's crazy.
And bone fragments less than a centimeter long. How could they be so small?
Now, are you following along in your handout? We're like most of the way through the evidence of controlled demolition for the Twin Towers. That's the second handout, the first one being Building 7. Look at the explosions on the right. Streamers shooting up and out with explosive force, thick billowing dust and smoke with pyroclastic or heat-induced cauliflower-formed clouds. Look at World Trade Center 1. Up and out. The geometry is similar to that of fireworks, where explosive force is going against gravity and in all directions symmetrically, up and out. It's been referred to like a banana peeling. Fire doesn't do this. Are all the columns cut and exploded at once? Let's take a look.
Words of a senior blaster.
We blow the basement, all the columns in the basement. Then we crack it up at the top to get it started. We go every other floor, all the way down. Every explosive has a timer on it. That's why it's controlled. When the columns go, each floor goes down and impacts the one below and keeps going.
Here's what demolition experts use in steel-framed buildings. The linear shaped charge.
It's a chevron-shaped or V-shaped charge that you can focus at a specific target, and it's lethal. It generates around 3 million pounds per square inch pressure at a speed, depending on the explosive inside the shaped charge, in excess of 27,000 feet per second.
Well, do we have columns in the World Trade Center that show evidence of shaped charges?
Were the underground explosions intended to blow out the Twin Towers' basements, followed by blasts heard inside the buildings of shaped charges slicing the core?
Because of the secondary explosion, we've got numerous people covered with dust from the secondary explosion.
Demolition pre-weakening usually takes place well in advance of the final blast, but at the World Trade Center, critical prep work might have had to occur in a very compressed time frame in the panicked aftermath of the plane strikes. These core columns were discovered after the collapse. The angled cut occurs in exactly the manner that shaped charges slice through steel beams to control the way they fall. Notice the hardened, once liquid metal. Was thermite used with the shaped charge?
The job of the shaped charge is to cut steel H-beams.
The way we do this is by cutting the beam at an angle, which, through a series of beams cut at the same angle, will tend to make the building shift over and walk.
More angled cuts from the World Trade Center steel. The shortest distance between 2 points is, anybody? Straight line. If you're going to be out there sweating your buns off as an iron worker cutting steel, are you going to cut diagonally? More angled cuts. And by the way, they used oxyacetylene torches to cut the steel in the aftermath of 9/11, not thermite torches. In other words, all the slag you saw on that other cut is not produced by oxyacetylene. Oxyacetylene is a fairly clean cut. Here's another angled cut, series of angled cuts. Now, the core columns in the World Trade Center are quite easily accessed from the elevators. Here's the whole floor plan up here. In red, we've blown up the core. This is down at the ground floor. All of the elevators are adjacent to all of the core columns. The core columns are can be accessed directly through the elevator shafts. We know that ACE Elevator was modernizing the elevators in the World Trade Centers during the 9 months prior to 9/11, and they're out of business today. I'm not saying they had anything to do with placing explosives. I don't know. I'm just pointing out the evidence and the possibility that there's access to the columns. And even on the upper floors where some of the elevators stop and you have utility closets or even some open office space up there, you can get into the floor system and crawl actually all through the floor without being detected by the occupants of the building. It looks to me, I'm not an expert in controlled demolition, but if you had charges, in addition to the thermite cutting charges, which cut the steel at these perfect 30-foot lengths that they fell to the ground in, ready for loading and shipment, you would need an explosive force large enough to disperse those columns a second or half a second or millisecond after they were cut in order to cause them to land 500 feet away in these other buildings and blow everything up. Because remember, all of the floors were pulverized. All the building contents. We'll be looking at that in a moment. So there was access. And of course, wireless detonation is a common means. You don't have to run wires everywhere through the building. You can simply plant a device at each location. And at some point, you have to intuitively ask yourself, does this look like an explosive force? Or does it look like a gravitational collapse? All of these 20-ton beams cut individually, separated from each other, from bolted and welded connections. This doesn't happen with a gravitational collapse. All of these pieces, individualized. Look at this. Now, there's 2,700 people in both of these buildings that lost their life on 9/11. We need to acknowledge that as we're going through this material and honor them and their families by getting at an investigation which finds out what the hell happened. It's extremely important that we do this. And when you come up against a 9/11 debunker or government official or anybody, newscaster, that says we've already looked into that, it's not necessary, use the force and the power of the honoring of the dead in this building to give you the inspiration to move through this resistance that you're going to face in the world as you tell your friends about this story and as they think you're crazy because they haven't been through this presentation. They haven't seen the evidence. They have to see the evidence. You have to send them a video, a DVD, a link to my website, which will have this video on it. Use the honoring, use the force of the honoring of the fallen ones to get to the truth. Let's take a look and see if we have a rapid onset of destruction. This is the North Tower. Watch closely. The first thing we see is an explosion which will rock the building on the left, which the tripod is mounted on, of the camera. And then the building comes down rapidly, symmetrically, sudden onset. Let's take another look, because what you're going to see is a whole bunch of smoke all of a sudden coming up here prior to the building coming down. The second thing you're going to see is that this is the impact of the greatest fires. You're going to see the collapse starts about right here, but oddly enough, it's from here up that you see the collapsing floors, not from here down. You'll see the telescoping floors. We're going to lose about 15 floors right here before anything starts going down from this point. It's very curious, and it violates the official theory of the pancake or the column failure theory. Now watch for all the smoke up here first. There's the shaking of the explosion. Here's the smoke from the explosion. Hasn't gone down yet, and now you'll see it from this point forward. Down, 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 and then coming down. Those floors are taken out from the point of impact, up, and then down. Okay, let's take an even closer look. Already into the collapse, we see a new fuel source of smoke and, of flames. And all the way around the building simultaneously. The smoke occurs actually prior to the collapse. there's explosion, and then we have the fall. And in the first second or two, we have this incredible release of pyroclastic smoke, heat-induced, and pulverized concrete. And even FEMA and NIST acknowledge that the antenna falls half a second before the rest of the building, which indicates that there was core column failure first, which is what you would want to do in a controlled demolition. Do we have demolition waves removing the column support? Let's take a look and listen.
Appearing to fall away from the rest of the building. Can we go to the tape?
Already, you see the explosions? Watch.
Tape now? Here we go, right here.
There's another row right there. The beams individualized coming out. Incredible volumes of dust in the first second.
When you look at it,
and then, of course, this mass is you'd expect this 40-story building, if it were, according to the official story, pushing the rest of the building down, it's falling away, as he said. You'd expect to see that mass in a mangled heap down at the bottom. You don't. It disappears into this cloud of dust. You do not see any mass of building. It's completely individually shredded down to its structural elements, and the building contents are completely
that tower
pulverized.
just came down.
Let's go to Bob Bazell, who was at St. Vincent's Hospital.
All the way around the building, simultaneously, proceeding at the pace of free fall speed, or near free fall speed, somewhere between 10 and 15 seconds, depending on who you listen to. Okay? Advancing rows of progressions of perfectly straight line around the building. Structural steel ejected, smoke where the top of the building used to be. Watch these individual explosions. You can see every one of them. One, two, and then you'll see some come up here. Up and out, all the way around the building. Now here's the South Tower from another angle. You see some fire. Otherwise, all you see is smoke. The fire's not engulfing this building at the time of its collapse. The fire's already burned out largely, and yet you have this collapse. Well, steel regains its strength when it cools. So NIST spent a lot of time analyzing why the South Tower came down first. I should say, manipulating us to believe why it came down first. Okay, there are examples, at least one, of a top-down demolition. Let's watch it again. It's a grain elevator. I don't know why they took it down first. I guess because it had this huge hole in the middle of it, so it made sense. It even followed the path of least resistance. It's very difficult to get a building to fall down straight through itself, even with highly paid engineers and months of planning and setting charges.
Has to do with looking at the way that the top of the South Tower came down. Now it first started to tilt, but what you see if you look at it carefully is that it starts to tilt, but right at about this point, the tilting stops as it's going into the dust cloud and actually starts to right itself. That contradicts the law of conservation of angular momentum, barring demolition, because the fulcrum would have been causing it to rotate faster. So the only explanation is that the entire top of the building has been shredded, presumably by demolition, and that's what caused it to stop rotating because the moment of inertia was destroyed.
Which of these buildings that's hanging by the crane is going to fall first? How many say the one on the left? Makes sense, right? There's nothing underneath it. It's going to hit the ground first. Well, wrong. On 9/11, they both hit the ground at the same time. The one that has to crush through 100,000 tons of steel falls at the same rate as the one that is free-falling through the air. And where's the pile driver anyway? It's completely missing. It's been shredded before the collapse gets about 2/3 of the way down the building. It's gone. There's no top of this building pushing the rest of this building down. That is the entire theory of the official pancaking or pile driving theory. Conservation of momentum requires mass. So if there's no pile driver, what's pushing the rest of the building down underneath it? You've all played this game, how long ago? 20, 30 years. We had these kinetic energy balls. Well, if you don't have any mass, you can't get the ball to come out the other side. If you don't have a pile driver, you can't push the building down. Something else has to be doing it. That can only be explosives. Now, watch the rubble falling outside the building at the same rate that this missing pile driver is theoretically pushing the building down all the way to the ground at the same rate.
Oh my God.
Well, almost the same rate. Let's look at it another way. You take a fifth of the mass of a building. It's like Jenga. How many of you played that block game where you stack them up and you try to wait till they tip over? You put one on top. Is it going to crush the rest, even if there was some column failure on a floor? No, the mass of the building below will resist. There's many ways to look at this. Every one of them exposes that on 9/11, many laws of physics were violated. Do we have squibs or explosive cutter charges visible at the upper floors? Let's see.
In all the videos of the collapses, explosions can be seen bursting from the building 20 to 30 stories below the demolition wave. Here, 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 here,
I think we get the idea. It goes on and on. What are these squibs? Well, we're told by NIST that these are puffs of air which is caused by the building, which doesn't exist up top, pushing down, causing air to come through the elevator shaft, out into the open office plan, and through, somehow, mysteriously, the exact center of these buildings, symmetrically around the buildings, 40 floors or more below the ensuing collapse. Puffs of air. Well, first of all, they're not puffs of air. They're pulverized building materials. And second of all, these explosions can be, you can calculate their velocity because we have the video. It's 100 to 200 feet per second. The puffs of air are not going to create that velocity. Third of all, say that was the elevator over there. The air came down through the elevator. This is an open office plan. This is about 60-foot span. Guess what? The air coming down through there is going to fill the room uniformly and then blow out every window if it has that much pressure, which it probably wouldn't. It wouldn't be a highly focalized ejection at the center point symmetrically around these buildings, and it wouldn't be 40 floors below. Do we have a straight-down symmetrical collapse outside the footprint? Yes, 1,400-foot diameter to be exact, with the explosive force on the aluminum cladding, which went the farthest. The debris area was 20 times the area of the footprint of the towers. Here is the plan. Here is the devastated area. I'm going to go back and forth really fast so you can see them. Note the nice rubble pile that Building 7 produced and then the expansive debris field of the Twin Towers, a completely opposite type of controlled demolition, leaving a smoking crater, not a pile of pancakes. This is a 7-story lobby. About 2 stories, maybe 3 of it, are filled with debris. Where is the rest of the debris? Where are the 110 floors of 20-gauge steel decking with 4 inches of concrete on it, 110 floors, an acre in size, 43,000 square feet per floor? Wouldn't we expect to see 1 or 2 of them down at the bottom, or 50? They couldn't find any steel decking. They couldn't find any trusses. They couldn't find any macroscopic chunks of concrete. It was pulverized to dust, as we'll see. This is what buildings look like when they pancake collapse. Again, from Mexico, a concrete structure fallen in an earthquake. We see stuff at the base of the building. The panels are missing. Tom Patrizio, the guy who brought the panels to the World Trade Center in the 60s, was looking for them as he was working on the demolition. He couldn't find one of them. We'd expect to see maybe 1/8 of the height of the building. We don't. We see about maybe 2%. You can see right through these tree fork columns at the base. Do we have pools of molten metal? Leslie Robertson, structural engineer for the World Trade Center. As of 21 days after the attack, the fires are still burning and molten steel was still running. You have to deal with this. This is the structural engineer of the World Trade Center. When somebody says, NIST says there was no molten metal, no evidence of molten metal, you remind them of this structural engineer on October 5th, 2001 at the National Conference of Structural Engineers. Chief O'Toole says, remember seeing a crane lifting a steel building beam vertically from deep within the catacombs of the ground zero. It was dripping with molten steel. We saw the video from Mark Lazo already talking to us about the molten steel that he found in under all three buildings. The fires burned and molten metal flowed in the pile of ruins still settling beneath my feet. Sarah Atlas. We already saw the previously solidified molten metal. Thermite-induced World Trade Center demolitions would explain the molten metal. Let's take a look. Well, first, from the fire department.
Down below, and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like lava.
Like lava flowing through a volcano. That's pretty clear. Now, what does NIST say, the head engineer at NIST, say about the molten metal?
I'm curious about the pool of molten steel that was found in the bottom of the towers.
I am too.
And
just tell me about it. Have you seen it?
Well, not personally, but eyewitnesses there found huge pools of molten steel beneath the towers, and some scientists don't think that the collapse of the building could have melted all that steel. And physics professor analyzed some of the steel, and Stephen Jones, and he found evidence of thermate residue, which would explain how the buildings collapsed by means of pre-planted explosives. So, have you analyzed the steel for any of those residues?
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like
lava.
I'm an architect, not a judge of character. But my personal opinion is that this man is lying through his teeth, and we need to call him on it, and we need a new investigation. Where does this molten metal come from?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. This is thermite melting the engine of a car. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. The second product of a thermite reaction is aluminum oxide, visible as white smoke. Was thermite used in conjunction with explosives on September 11th? Watch this very bright substance pouring from the 81st floor of the South Tower. And white smoke appeared at the base of the building. Would this be aluminum oxide, the byproduct of a thermite reaction? Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Was the molten metal pouring out of the South Tower aluminum from the melted airplane? NIST says yes. This is what molten aluminum looks like. It's silvery. It's not a bright, glowing liquid like molten iron looks like. Again, FEMA says they have evidence of a severe high-temperature corrosion attack on the steel, including oxidation, sulfidation. A liquid eutectic mixture containing primarily iron, oxygen, sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. No clear explanation of the source of the sulfur has been identified. Did they look at thermate? No. Chemical analysis is clear. Intergranular melting. By the way, fire does not produce intergranular melting. That is to say, normal office fires or even jet fuel-inspired fires. A 1-inch column being reduced to half-inch thickness, its edges, which are curled like a paper scroll, having been thinned to almost razor sharpness, gaping holes, some larger than a silver dollar. Did fire do this to steel? No physicist will say yes.
Steel in dragon-like lengths and contortions spoke for itself, bent, deformed, without cracks.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
Typically you'd have buckling and tearing on the tension side, but there's no buckling at all. There's no buckling at all.
Well, some of this previously molten steel was sent to Stephen Jones at BYU for analysis. He's a physicist, and what did he find? Well, first of all, he says if thermite reaction was used to ignite a fire, they produce a characteristic burn pattern. This is well known by fire investigators. It would contain more unusual elements like fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. So he knew what to look for. So the previously molten metal is predominantly iron, so we can rule out aluminum from the jet planes. It has very little chromium, so we can rule out molten structural steel. It's primarily iron, not steel. This is very important because the byproduct of thermate reaction is not steel, it's iron, molten iron. The previously molten metal has small amounts of aluminum, sulfur, potassium, the telltale signature of thermite, and manganese and fluorine in abundance, also used in thermite charges. And the second sample from the slag from this memorial at Clarkston University sent to Stephen Jones, this piece right here. He did X-ray fluorescence and also showed fluorine, sulfur, manganese, potassium. Now, if gel explosives were used, we'd expect to see, well, gel explosives are tiny aluminum particles in iron oxide, and they can be cast into shape because they're like a gel. They're not just powder. And they produce a very high density and extremely powerful charge. So they're put into linear cutting devices like this, where you see the round circle being the sol gel, and the vertical element that's hatched is the structural steel element. So you'd see something like this in a thermite linear-shaped cutting charge, which is indeed from the World Trade Center steel, in fact, building number 7. But sol gels would hold, that thermite would leave a telltale residue. In this case, with sol gels, 1,3-diphenylpropane. Diphenylpropane. An analysis that Dr. Jones did on the WTC steel finds, indeed, there's 1,3-diphenylpropane. In fact, it's corroborated by the EPA. What do they say? One molecule described by the EPA's Eric Schwartz was present at levels that dwarfed all others. 1,3-diphenylpropane. We've never observed it in any other sampling that we've done. Well, that's not all. The dust that was sent to him from an apartment gathered by Jeanette McKinley in a plastic bag and sent to Stephen Jones, he put a magnet over it. It was the first thing he did. He's looking for metallic objects in the World Trade Center dust. Remember, it blanketed Manhattan 4 inches thick. 0.1% about rose up to the magnet. What in the world could that be? Well, he found, first of all, that all of it was spherical, up to the size almost of a BB, or 1/16 of an inch, which is very curious. He did a chemical analysis on it, and he finds all the telltale signs, once again, of thermite. How did they get round? Well, the only hypothesis that's reasonable is that the thermite cutting charge produces the molten iron. A fraction of a second later, the explosives atomize it, sending it and all the beams way out, and it gets so small due to the explosives that it forms itself into a sphere due to the surface tension, just like a raindrop does, and it cools as it comes through the air, and it falls on the cars, and I'll show you how it corrodes all of the cars surrounding. It's the primary source of corrosion, the only one that most of us can think of. And the EPA found the same spheres and the same chemical makeup that Dr. Jones did. This is all corroborated. Now, you have to deal with this physical evidence. You can't go away and say, I didn't quite hear to my satisfaction that these buildings were blown up. Unless you rationally deal with every one of these, or the people you're talking to tell you the same, they have to rationally deal with everything that we in the 9/11 Truth Movement are saying about this physical evidence about the controlled demolition. These are the cars, thousands of them corroded on the tops, not the sides, not from the explosions, but from some corrosive element, such as thermite, settling on them. Manganese is also found by the city's chief examiner in surrounding buildings, a highly toxic substance, again, a telltale sign of thermate. So, Dr. Jones's conclusions, and two other physicists and a geologist, are that with all of this iron, fluorine, manganese, aluminum, sulfur, and barium 1,3-diphenylpropane, that indeed thermite was used deliberately placed in both the World Trade Center towers and Building 7. Okay? Is there dust clouds? Enormous, thick, billowing. This is what buildings look like when they fall over. This is what the World Trade Center looks like.
One of the most significant things to my thinking that indicates that this could not have been the sort of collapse that we are told it was is the presence of the dust clouds. And as you've seen in the pictures, and I'm sure all of us have seen probably more than we would like. There were very, very large clouds of very thick dust that enveloped the area, that crossed the river, that made it almost all the way to New Jersey.
You can see the building pulverizing itself to dust in the first couple of seconds. We're not talking about the kinetic energy of a 40-story or a 20-story building. There's no kinetic energy developed, or very little, in the first second. The explosions are the kinetic energy that creates the dust. And that's 100-micron dust, the width of a human hair. What mechanism is required to turn 90,000 tons of concrete into dust, most of which is the width of a human hair? There's no concrete left, no large macroscopic chunks of concrete blanketing downtown Manhattan. What about the people? Fewer than 300 whole bodies were found. 1,100 victims remain unidentified. 800 victims identified by DNA alone. Nearly 20,000 pieces of bodies found. 6,000 small enough to fit into test tubes. 200 matched to a single person. One person blown to 200 different pieces. Can a gravitational force explain that? Nearly 10,000 unidentified pieces frozen for future identification. And 1,000 victims never identified. And don't forget those 700 bone fragments, a half an inch long, at the top of the Deutsche Bank building that they just found. Is there characteristics of fire? Well, first of all, even FEMA and NIST acknowledge that the fire did not melt the steel. We're missing 1,000 degrees of temperature. Fires get to be about 1,500 to 1,700 degrees maximum in normal office fires, or even jet fuel stoked fires, hardly sufficient to melt steel, which begins at 2,730 degrees. So the steel loses about half its temperature at about half its strength at about 1,200 degrees. So NIST and FEMA had to support a fire hot enough to cause that weakening. So they allege that it got up to 1,800 degrees, but in fact there's no evidence to suggest that it reached any temperature over 400 or 500 degrees. This test of by chorus construction in England showed that in an open office garage, the fire could only get, that is to say, the steel temperature above the fire, they could only get it to 680 degrees in a similar type of ranged test. Using metallographic analysis, FEMA concluded, I think it was first FEMA and then NIST, both, that none of the steel reached over 452 degrees by measuring how the steel stretches and leaves the paint behind to crack. You can actually analyze the temperature. They specifically chose the steel from the locations in the trade center that were to supposedly receive the hottest temperatures. And then when they found that they were only 452 degrees, they said, well, that wasn't from the hottest place in the trade center. Their own core column studies show relatively cool temperatures, which contradicts their assertion that the fire has reached 1,800 degrees. As you can see, this woman in the upper left is standing in the hole that was supposed to be a raging inferno in the North Tower. There's no fire. The fire burnt out and moved on to other places, leaving the steel to cool. On the right, we see a fire, bright emergent flames, long-lasting, and very, very hot. We didn't have either of those three conditions in either of the Twin Towers. In fact, that's proven in the South Tower by Chief Oreo Palmer, who reached the 78th floor 10 minutes before the collapse, says we could knock it out with 2 lines. That's 2 fire hoses. Coming down from above him, Brian Clark, who brought a victim down through the fire, said it was lapping up against the wall, the flames. fire was virtually out. In fact, no high-rise building has ever collapsed due to fire. Kevin Ryan, a whistleblower from Underwriters Lab, wrote NIST and said, hey, you tested the floor assemblies. You hired UL to test the floor assemblies, and they proved that they did not collapse. In fact, the UL test showed a maximum deflection of only 4 inches. And you, NIST, used in your report a deflection of 42 inches to justify that there was this force that pulled in the outer columns, causing them to buckle and fail. That's a huge leap of faith. Okay, so Kevin Ryan was fired from his job as a result of bringing this public. Also, the UL test had 2,000 degrees of testing under these series of 4 trusses under the assembly that was being tested, and put a load on it that exceeded a floor load, weight on top of the structures that exceeded the World Trade Center loading by a factor of 2. Completely unrealistic test, and yet it did not fail. It did not fail. NIST claimed, well, we can't use these tests. We got to rely on the observations that we made, because the observations, again and again, NIST is looking at what happened through a pair of binoculars, and they crank their computer graphic results up and up and up with these illogical values in this black box that we don't have the data for to prove that their theory of the fire is what brought the buildings down. Fire engineering thus called the FEMA investigation initially a half-baked farce. That's a pretty serious charge from a group of fire protection engineers that are responsible for finding out what happened in fires and preventing it. Structural damage from the planes and the explosive ignition of jet fuel in themselves were not enough to bring down the towers. A full-throttled, full-resourced forensic investigation is imperative. Let's take a look quickly at the NIST report. Their goal was to determine how and why World Trade Center 1 and 2 collapsed and how and why World Trade Center 7 collapsed. Let's read their scope very carefully. The focus of the investigation was on the sequence of events from the instant of aircraft impact up to the initiation of collapse for each tower. For brevity in this report, this sequence is referred to as the probable collapse sequence, although it does not actually include the structural behavior of the tower after the conditions for the collapse initiation were reached and collapse became, they allege, inevitable. What have they done? They stopped their investigation before any of the significant events began, before any of the evidence for controlled demolition became extremely obvious. They cannot afford to look at anything after this theoretical initiation of collapse, which they can't even support without falsified data. All of this is very carefully documented in Jim Hoffman's excellent treatise, Building a Better Mirage, NIST's 3-year, $20 million cover-up of the crime of the century. I encourage you to look through it and find the scads of unfounded assumptions. The mountain of distraction in the 10,000 pages, which includes 1,000 pages of airplane modeling, 100 pages of fire modeling, and a 1.5 page on their key assertion, which everything hangs on, a presumption that collapse initiation is followed by global collapse without any time or analysis spent on proving that. They refuse to publish the data. You can't get this is a public investigation. The American people have the right, who paid for this investigation, to have it be open This is fairly typical of many of the investigations going on with the 9/11. It's full of outrageous lies, fudged computer simulations, as I've mentioned, calling structural engineers, therefore, calling upon NIST and reaming NIST about their refusal to show the visualizations of their animations. Now, NIST finally came back and answered a few questions about controlled demolition. And they said it couldn't be a controlled demolition. It didn't start at the bottom. That's the basic, that's what it boils down to. Well, I showed you one controlled demolition that started at the top. So they have no attempt to justify the sequential floor collapse mechanism or their column failure theory as it causing the building to collapse. Thus, the entire collapse theory becomes a completely unsupported opinion. It's not technical analysis. You can take the whole thing, 10,000 pages, and throw it in the garbage. Was there foreknowledge of the Twin Towers collapse? Well, FEMA was on site the day before with hundreds of employees for a drill for a fake biological attack right in downtown Manhattan, ready to go on 9/11. In fact, Tom Kenny says, we arrived late Monday night and from FEMA, went right into action on Tuesday morning. Coincidence? How about Giuliani?
I went down to the scene and we set up headquarters at 75 Barclay Street, which was right there with the police commissioner, the fire commissioner, the head of emergency management. And we were operating out of there when we were told that the World Trade Center was going to collapse. And it did collapse before we could actually get out of the building. So we were trapped in the building for 10, 15 minutes and finally found an exit and got out, walked north, and took a lot of people with us.
We were told it was going to collapse, and 10 minutes later it collapsed. No high-rise building has ever collapsed due to fire. There was no indication that this building was going to collapse, other than the fact that somebody had planted explosives and knew it was going to collapse and planned to take it down. Is there expert corroboration?
If you've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
It was live on television. I mean, just literally millions of people.
Van Romero, explosives expert and demolition expert. It's too methodical to be a chance result of airplanes colliding with the structures. My opinion is, based on the videotapes, that after the airplanes hit the World Trade Center, there were some explosive devices inside the buildings which caused the towers to collapse. Mike Taylor, demolition expert, in The New Scientist wrote, it looked like a classic controlled demolition. The collapse of the World Trade Center towers mirrored the strategy used by demolition experts. The explosions at the higher level floors enabled the collapse to gain downward momentum. All three of these experts have withdrawn their statements or justified or qualified them in some way. In the case of Van Romero, he was given a huge financial federal contract. Structural engineers question the World Trade Center collapses. William Rice, the prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the Twin Towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a free fall speed as if the 100,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel framework underneath did not exist. Even FEMA's structural engineer, Ron Hamburger, initially said, and later qualified, it appeared to me that the charges had been placed in the buildings, and yet the official investigations never considered controlled demolition with explosives, despite all this evidence. New York Fire Department. Many firemen know there were bombs in the buildings, but they are afraid for their jobs to admit it because the higher-ups forbid discussion of this fact. Paul Isaac, New York Fire Department. I know 9/11 was an inside job, the police know it's an inside job, and the firemen know it too. So what did destroy the World Trade Center towers? Was it fire, jetliner crash, a highly unusual controlled demolition, a gravitational collapse, explosions, pancaking collapse? Well, what happens when we're confronted with this information? We've seen a lot of proof and a lot of evidence for controlled demolition that about 95% of you are convinced brought down the World Trade Center. Nevertheless, your worldview is not the same as it was 2 hours ago. We're shaken up by this information because I've shown that Al-Qaeda couldn't have planted these explosives in these highly secure buildings. We gotta really deal with this information, and there's different ways in which we deal with it. We can go into paralysis and have no action whatsoever. We go into a series of defense. I understand this. Defensive excuses and avoidance techniques such as, hey, our government would never do this to us. They've never done it before. Well, it turns out that false flag operations to gain access to other countries have been done to get us into every major war we've had back to the inception of this country. Well, I would have heard about it by now. Well, you're hearing about it now, okay? It's never too late to hear about it and to do something about it. And Barry Zwicker's going to talk to you about why you may not have heard about it by now. It couldn't have been kept a secret, all those people that must have been involved. Well, the Manhattan Project had a hell of a lot more people involved, and it was a very well-kept secret. I'm not an expert in controlled demolition. I'm not qualified to respond. Okay? Neither am I. But we have controlled demolition experts who have. And you've seen all the evidence. It's too horrible. I just don't want to think about it. That's what I did when I first heard about this. But you have to think about it. Your country, my country, depends on you thinking about this and doing something and moving out of paralysis. Don't say, I didn't see this stuff tonight. Don't avoid the debate. Don't go back to sleep. And don't become part of the problem. Let's find a way to move into action. Let's get informed. Get the information. Move past the paralysis. Work through our fears, our disbeliefs, our mindsets, based on the rational reaction that we can have to very scientific data, not upon our emotional reaction to our worldview being turned upside down. And let's support a new investigation. This is our responsibility as citizens. Now, unfortunately, it's not just the buildings. Wherever you go in the official story, you find holes, huge holes. Whether it's the airline flights, where the transponders were turned off all at the same time, and many other abnormalities that don't fit the official story. The NORAD stand down for an hour and a half, allowing the planes through. The hijackers, which aren't on the flight manifests, 8 of them are still alive, interviewed by the BBC, some of them. FBI obstruction of justice and the many FBI whistleblowers that have come forward. The stock market put options, which millions have been made on the flights of the fated airliners, the airliners, of the fated flights. Osama bin Laden, where we have one confessing and one denying. Are they two different people? One's stout, one's gaunt. Others have written many books and tapes, and you owe it to yourself to get informed. Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth don't go into all of this, but I wanted to bring it to your attention as a focus for your future research. The 9/11 Commission, with its massive conflicts of interest in the staffing, terrorist funding has been tied to the Pakistan government, are best friends. Afghanistan, a profit center for heroin production. The defense, oil, debt, insurance, and media industries whose profits soared by huge percentages and whose board members sit on each other's companies and industries such that they tend to move as a flock of birds for their own interests and not yours or mine. And the mainstream media blocking the truth of 9/11. What did William Colby say, the former CIA director? The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, owns everyone of any significance in the major media. That's a hell of a statement to be made by the head of the CIA. In fact, it's true. The Operation Mockingbird started in the late 40s, and it was very successful. And who was involved in it? Frank Wisner, Ellen Dulles, Richard Helms, Philip Graham. Barry can tell you more about this. If he doesn't, be sure to ask him. There are organizations like Barry's and authors and such as Project Censored, Peter Phillips, who dedicate their lives to bringing us the truth, because we haven't seemed to have gotten it in the mainstream media. So why didn't we see the truth about 9/11? Well, it appears as if our government lied to us about the building collapses. The 9/11 Commission reinforced that lie. FEMA and NIST justified the lie. And the corporate media repeated and hammered in the lie. We really didn't have much of a chance. Now, I've proven to you that explosives were used to destroy, well, at least most of you, each of the 3 World Trade Center high-rise buildings on 9/11. It takes months of planning and advanced planning to place explosives. And certainly Al-Qaeda didn't have access to these highly secure buildings occupied by the Department of Defense, the IRS, the CIA, etc. Architects and engineers in 9/11 Truth don't speculate as to who was responsible. So unfortunately, this is just the beginning of a disturbing but very essential journey for all of us. The evidence you've seen tonight is just a fraction of that which the 9/11 movement has assembled. The questions raised are numerous and ominous that must be answered in a new investigation. I encourage you to discover this evidence. And there are some great books and DVDs available. And in fact, I think they're available tonight as you walk out the door. Some of them are free. The 9/11 Mysteries DVD that you've seen clips of tonight is in your packet of information. Everyone, architects and engineers and others, go online and sign the petition at our website, ae911truth.org. Show your support. This is one of the most effective websites now because architects and engineers have the necessary credibility to turn heads, to raise eyebrows, to get the discussion into the halls of Congress. And you can all support us, whether you're an architect, an engineer, or not. The truth is that millions of people are studying these matters. 49% of New Yorkers believe 9/11 was planned. It's growing by millions every year. How many of you agree that an investigation, whether you agree with the evidence for controlled demolition or not, how many of you agree that an investigation conducted at the highest level of government is required? Lots and lots of hands. There's some question as to whether we trust the government to do this or not. I can appreciate that. Sign our petition, be counted, because a time comes when silence is betrayal. Martin Luther King. Thank you very much.